Hello. I am Dr. Crystal Downing, and I am the co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center, along with my husband, Dr. David C. Downing, and you'll be seeing more of him later. In fact, both of us, welcome you to this very special night when we not only celebrate an impressive new book on Tolkien, and you'll have an opportunity later to buy it at a special discount rate and get the author's signature, but we also this evening have an opportunity to consider the various ways that Wade authors have contributed to spiritual formation. This evening is made possible by friends of the Wade who established the Stephen and Marjorie Mead Endowment for Spiritual Formation, not only in honor of Marge's nearly 50 years of service to the Wade, but also as a memorial to the life of her wonderful husband, Steve, who passed into eternal glory in 2021. Marge will be introducing our speaker tonight, author Dr. Holly Ordway, but before she does, I have several announcements to make for you. Number one, remember that tomorrow at 4 p.m., Dr. Ordway will be speaking in this exact same place, only on a specific reflection on the way Tolkien's faith informs his fiction. And you'll definitely want to hear that. Two, tonight after Dr. Ordway's presentation, you'll be able to ask questions, and we'll have a mic that will be passed among you, so all you have to do is raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you. Three, and please feel free to come in. We have seats up front here. Three, after the question and answer time, please make your way out to the bookshop, and I will be escorting our presenter out there. That's the best place to talk to her after you buy her book at a special 20% discount just for you tonight. And also we'll extend it to tomorrow if you come to the afternoon lecture at 4 p.m. tomorrow. You can get her signature, you can ask her additional questions if they come up after our Q&A session tonight. If you want information on applying for the Mead grant to support Wade research on spiritual formation, please visit the Wade website under grants, and you can learn all about it. Number 5, please greet Wade Associate Director Marjorie Mead, who has known our guest speaker, Dr. Holly Ordway, for years. Marjorie.
Good evening. It's wonderful to have all of you here. This is an exciting evening for us. It's a privilege to welcome Dr. Holly Ordway as our second speaker in the Wade Center's Spiritual Formation series. I continue to be very grateful for the donors whose generosity has made this unique Wade offering possible. Holly has been a friend of mine and of the Wades for many years. She is the Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute, as well as visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and her first book on Tolkien, titled Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, published in 2021 by Word on Fire, deservedly received much critical acclaim. including the 2022 Mythopoeic Society Scholarship Award in Inkling Studies. I was enthusiastic. As much as I already knew about Tolkien's life, this was an area that, apart from his letters, was largely unknown. But I must say, having read about a third of the way into this book, my expectations have been thoroughly surpassed. First of all, the quality of research is to be highly commended. But when you consider what Holly has accomplished in a very short period of a mere 2 years from when she published Tolkien's Modern Reading, it actually is stunning. A work of this depth and breadth can easily take 5 years or more to write, much less publish. But even more significantly, this book offers an engaging and accessible understanding of the Catholic faith and devotional practices that meant so much to Tolkien. Indeed, if you want to truly grasp Tolkien's deeply held religious beliefs and how they both informed and transformed his life, look no further. I highly recommend this excellent and insightful book. You will not be disappointed. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Holly Ordway as she speaks on A Hard-Won Faith, Tolkien's Spiritual Journey.
Well, thank you very much for that. Welcome, Marge. This is just marvelous to be here. It's an honor and a pleasure to be speaking here at the Wade Center. First of all, just physically to be here in this place where I have done research for both Tolkien's Modern Reading and indeed for Tolkien's Faith. And in fact, there are 2 photos from the Wade Center's archives that appear in the photo gallery. So we can see some tangible connection right there. But especially it's an honor and a delight to be speaking as part of the Mead Spiritual Formation Endowment, because Marge has been such, not just a supporter, but an encourager. And that's a special, I think, a special gift of the Holy Spirit, to be able to encourage people in their work, in their vocation, in their lives of faith. And that's something that Marge has done, and that I think we can be sure that this endowment that takes, the name, the Mead Spiritual Formation Endowment, will continue to do for more people. So blessings on that endeavor. So tonight, I'm talking about Tolkien's spiritual journey. And there's far more that I could say about that than I could possibly fit in one talk. But don't worry, I will not keep you here for a talk that's the length of the extended edition of the Lord of the Rings films. What I'm going to focus on tonight are 2 themes, which are suffering and friendship, and the way that these were part of Tolkien's spiritual formation. Tolkien was a committed Christian, and he was not shy about saying so publicly. A repeated theme in the recollections of those who knew him was how integral his faith was to him. It was part of his whole person. And it manifested itself in a natural manner. It was not put forward awkwardly or ostentatiously. Clyde Kilby, who assisted him in his work on the Silmarillion, recalled, "Not a single visit I made to Tolkien's home in which the conversation did not at some point fall easily into a discussion of religion, or rather Christianity." And Kilby, of course, is a name of note here at the Wade Center, and we'll come back to him and to his friendship with Tolkien later in this talk. Tolkien's faith was lifelong and deep, but we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that therefore it was easy, or that it had always been steady going. Not at all. Tolkien's early years were full of loss and sorrow. His father died when he was only 4 years old, and his beloved mother Mabel died when he was 12, leaving him and his little brother Hilary under the guardianship of Father Francis Morgan, one of the priests of the Birmingham Oratory, where Mabel had become a parishioner before she died. Tolkien came under Father Francis's care during the darkest and saddest time of his young life. But there's no bitterness in his recollections of Father Francis, whom he called his second father. In later years, Tolkien said that he first learned charity and forgiveness from his guardian, Father Francis Morgan. And it may seem strange that he should include charity that is, love, alongside forgiveness as one of the things that he learned from his guardian. So how could he have first learned love from his guardian when he had loved and been loved by his beloved mother, Mabel? And we can understand this better when we consider his exact choice of words. Tolkien was a man of very warm emotions. He frequently used the word love to speak of his personal regard and his closeness to his wife, his children, and his friends, including Father Francis. The word charity appears much less often, and so it's notable that he uses it twice with regard to his guardian, both with Francis teaching him charity, and then also in describing Francis's astonishing charity in caring for him and his brother. Tolkien described charity as a Christian virtue and noted that charity must cover a multitude of sins, referencing 1 Peter 4:8. Charity, caritas, agape love. It's not just a warm feeling, it's self-giving, Christ-like love of one's neighbor. Charity, in this sense, is not calculating or self-serving. It demands nothing from the other, but quite a lot from oneself. And so, when Tolkien refers to the sudden miraculous experience of Father Francis's love and care and humor, he was using miraculous in a fairly literal way to indicate that these gifts were only possible through the grace of God. And it was in this sense that Tolkien had to learn charity from his guardian. He had to learn self-giving love, which he received as a boy with such generosity from his guardian. And it was not just charity that he learned from Father Francis, but also forgiveness. As a boy, Tolkien had much to forgive. His extended family had rejected his mother after she became a Catholic, and he felt that her early death came from a disease hastened by persecution of her faith. His Aunt May was the only member of the family that came to his dying mother's bedside, and after her death, his aunt, Beatrice Suffield, showed no affection to him, and even burned all his mother's letters without even consulting him. I know. So it's possible that Tolkien felt some very natural feelings of resentment towards his extended family, but also possibly towards his mother and even towards the church, because after all, it was her becoming a Catholic that had brought about this situation of poverty and stress and tension with his grandparents. And he might also have needed to forgive himself, as it's quite common for children who lose their parents to blame themselves in some way. So for all of these reasons, Father Francis would have felt that learning forgiveness was essential for his young ward's spiritual well-being. Feelings of grief, loneliness, anger, and hurt are not sins, but they're rather wounds to be healed. But if those wounds are allowed to fester, they could lead to hardness of heart, bitterness, even hatred, a breakdown of that charity to which all Christians are called. But these wounds were, in fact, tended to. As painful as his childhood was with the loss of his mother, Tolkien was able to develop a genuinely close relationship with his extended family. Father Francis ensured that Tolkien spent school holidays with relatives on both sides of his family, both his father's side and his mother's side, the Tolkien, Mitten, and Incledon families. And these interactions were a demonstration in action that Tolkien had forgiven or was endeavoring to forgive his relatives for the role that he believed they had played or had possibly played in his mother's suffering and death. Father Francis died 2 years before The Hobbit was published, having taught Tolkien so much about love and forgiveness. And perhaps it was due in part to the guidance and the example of his second father that Tolkien could write such a moving passage as the last scene between Bilbo Baggins and Thorin Oakenshield, the dwarven king under the mountain. Now the context is very different, but we can perhaps catch some echoes of the truth that Tolkien had learned from Francis about the healing effects of forgiveness. So the Battle of the Five Armies has been won, but at a great cost. Thorin is wounded unto death, and he calls the little hobbit to his side. "Farewell, good thief," he said. "I go now to the halls of waiting to sit beside my fathers until the world is renewed. Since I leave now all gold and silver, and go where it is of little worth, I wish to part in friendship from you. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell." Then Bilbo turned away, and he went by himself, and sat alone, wrapped in a blanket. And whether you believe it or not, he wept until his eyes were red and his voice was hoarse. He was a kindly little soul. Indeed, it was long before he had the heart to make a joke again. "A mercy it is," he said at last to himself, "that I woke up when I did. I wish Thorin were living, but I am glad we parted in kindness." The loss of Tolkien's parents at a young age was a major trauma in itself. And then there's more. Not many years later, he would go through the horrors of the Great War. Moving ahead in time, we find Tolkien sent to France in June of 1916, just 2 months after his marriage to his beloved Edith. Years later, he recalled the moment. "Parting from my wife then, we were only just married. It was like a death." And there, on the front lines of the Great War, he encountered a horror that was previously unimaginable, the first fully mechanized war. Trench warfare was a horrific stalemate. Men were slaughtered in attempts just to gain a few yards of territory, and the death toll was staggering. 880,000 British soldiers died in the conflict, 6% of the adult male population. By comparison, slightly over 100,000 US soldiers died. Death could come during an assault on German lines, from ordinary shelling and sniping, from accidental friendly fire, or as a consequence of some disease contracted in the waterlogged, rat-infested trenches. By 1918, as Tolkien wrote years later, all but one of my close friends were dead. What took Tolkien out of the front lines at the end of October 1916 was not a bomb or an exploding shell, but a serious case of trench fever. During the next 2 years, he spent much time in hospitals. A major relapse in the summer of 1918 resulted in his weight dropping by nearly 30 pounds, a major decline for a man with a spare and wiry frame. And he was finally declared 100% disabled and instructed to seek sedentary employment through the Ministry of Labor. Now, we should note that with the war's catastrophic death toll, the Army needed soldiers to return to service as soon as they were physically able to do so. And Tolkien was trained as a signals officer. He had very valuable skills. So the fact that he was never sent back to active duty really indicates how severely ill he had been. For Tolkien, trench fever meant suffering from a new, strange, and frightening illness. At that time, not only was there no cure, but none of the treatments had any effect. Most sufferers recover in a couple of months, but Tolkien's case became chronic, and it probably contributed to his recurring health problems throughout his life. In the face of this level of death and just day-to-day suffering, many of Tolkien's contemporaries abandoned the practice of their faith entirely. A certain young atheist named C.S. Lewis, remarking on his service in the trenches, admitted to being frightened all the time, but declared, "I never sank so low as to pray." But Tolkien himself did not have a crisis of faith during the war. Now, a different kind of spiritual crisis would come later, and we'll see that in a moment. And it's worth asking, why not? One of the Catholic chaplains in the Great War made the observation that the men who came to the war with a good working religion, with faith and instruction and a clear and definite rule of Christian life, were those who stood the test, the supreme test of war and the awful temptations of a soldier's life in foreign towns. And that describes Lieutenant Tolkien very well. Undoubtedly, part of Tolkien's spiritual resilience was due to having come through early experiences of bereavement with his faith intact. Having lost both of his parents by the time he was 12, he was no stranger to sorrow and death, and he was not surprised that life could end abruptly and cruelly, or that blessings could be portioned out with little apparent reason to some and not to others. His faith rested on a crucified Savior who suffered for him, alongside him, and alongside all mankind, and who rose again from the dead. Tolkien had developed real spiritual muscle even before 1914. And although the war undoubtedly deepened his depressive tendencies and confronted him with a depth of darkness that he could never forget, and indeed did never forget, it did not provoke a wholesale shaking of his foundations. So the war ended at last. Tolkien was demobilized, and he entered into life as a married man with a family and a developing career as an academic at Leeds University and then a few years later at Oxford. And at this time, although otherwise his life was settling into a peaceful routine, he entered into a dry stretch in his spiritual life. As he recalled years later to his son Michael, for a time, he said, I almost ceased to practice my religion. Now, we don't know exactly how long this barren stretch lasted, but the locations he gives to peg the outer boundaries of it give a range of almost 10 years. It was certainly long enough to weigh very heavily upon him. We also don't know exactly what Tolkien meant when he confessed that he almost ceased to practice his faith. He probably, I would say, became slack in his practice of personal prayer, and he seems to have felt a dryness, a sort of emptiness in his spiritual life. But by about 1930, by Tolkien's reckoning, he began once more to fully practice his faith, and it would deepen and grow stronger throughout the whole rest of his life. Now, as with the onset of this time of spiritual dryness, we don't know exactly what brought about the end. His son Christopher's birth in 1924 was for Tolkien a gift, he said, during this difficult time, and the arrival of Priscilla in 1929 may have been a factor as well. The joy of a long hoped-for daughter might have helped to shift Tolkien out of his spiritual rut. And another factor was probably his friendship with C.S. Lewis, which we'll come to in a moment. But in any case, Tolkien himself might not have been able to explain the reason behind this new season in his spiritual life. He would have considered any growth in faith to be entirely dependent on God's grace, though not without the freely chosen participation of the person in question. As Paul writes in his epistle to the Philippians, with fear and trembling work out your salvation, for it is God who worketh in you, both the will and to accomplish according to his good will. The Christian works out his salvation, but it is God who worketh in you. And this mysterious cooperation of divine and human action is something that Tolkien meditated upon. He wrote, as souls with free will, we are, so as it were, so placed as to face, or to be able to face, God. But God is, so to speak, also behind us, supporting, nourishing us. For Tolkien, one result of these seemingly fallow years in his spiritual life seems to have been greater insight into the role of the will in the life of faith. As he explained to his son Christopher in 1944, if you cannot achieve inward peace, and it is given to few to do so, least of all to me in tribulation, do not forget that the aspiration for it is not a vanity, but a concrete act. To make an effort toward that kind of peace is not a mere emotion or sentiment, but a movement of the will, which in Catholic devotional practice is called an act of hope or an act of faith. And in his brief comments on an aspiration being a concrete act, Tolkien is giving voice to an important aspect of his faith that he had learned through hard experience, to pay little attention to sensible consolations and pious feelings, and to focus on deliberate action. Feelings may come and go, but one can persist in prayer even in an arid state. In such periods, faith is more a matter of obedience than emotion. Now, all of these difficult experiences of his childhood and his early manhood would be more than enough to produce a bleak view of life. And indeed, Tolkien certainly had a depressive and melancholy streak in his character. But what's surprising is not so much that he had these times of melancholy, but that he also had such a deep-seated streak of joy and fun. His extraordinarily complex intellect was balanced by what he described in later years as a very simple sense of humor, which even my appreciative critics find tiresome. And one way that this joyful and playful aspect of his personality was expressed was in his deep-seated capacity for friendship, and indeed for deep spiritual friendship. Now, the friendship between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, surely one of the most significant and famous in literary history. It was utterly transformative for both men. And in fact, if they had never met, it's probable that we wouldn't know anything about either of them today. We wouldn't be here today hearing this lecture. In fact, this Wade Center would probably not exist. We should think about that, right? If Tolkien had not become friends with Lewis, then The Lord of the Rings would never have been finished, let alone published. As Tolkien put it years later, Lewis was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. And given how much of Tolkien's output remained unfinished, let alone published, this scenario is all too plausible. Conversely, without Tolkien, Lewis quite possibly would not have become a Christian, or at least not during the pivotal stage with his literary career ahead of him. And so we would not have had works like Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters, Chronicles of Narnia. As Lewis recalled years later, Tolkien gave him much help in his conversion. So their friendship, so famous now that we can almost take it for granted. But in some respects, their friendship was a very unlikely one. If we look at the cultural and social conditions in which these men met in 1926, we can see that for each of them, there were barriers that could easily have prevented their friendship from even getting started. Because in Tolkien's and Lewis's day, when they met in 1926, the differences between Catholics and Anglicans were much more keenly felt. Lewis, although he had abandoned his childhood Anglican faith and was still an atheist when he met Tolkien, had grown up in Northern Ireland, where anti-Catholic sentiment remained widespread, strong, and overt. As he put it in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, "At my first coming into the world, I had been implicitly warned never to trust a papist, and at my first coming into the English faculty explicitly, never to trust a philologist." Tolkien was both. And in that way, he said, friendship with Tolkien marked the breakdown of two old prejudices. His early upbringing might well have made him disinclined to become friends with a Catholic, having been conditioned to mistrust them. Why should he spend time with Tolkien when there were so many other interesting people in Oxford? Well, what about Tolkien? Now, he had plenty of personal experiences that might have made him distrustful of Protestants or people from Protestant backgrounds. He would have remembered the hostility of extended family when his mother Mabel became a Catholic. More immediately, he would have been well aware that as a Catholic himself, he was part of a tiny minority which had only recently been allowed back into Oxford University. When Tolkien took up the Rawlinson and Bosworth Chair of Anglo-Saxon, he was one of only 4 Catholics to hold professorial chairs at the university. And each of them was the first Catholic to have that chair since the Reformation. The English Reformation had cast a long shadow on Catholic life. The penal laws had gradually been abolished, but it took a very long time for Catholics to regain full civil rights. In fact, It was not until the year after Tolkien was elected to his professorial chair that the final restrictions on Catholic civil rights were lifted. It was not until the passing of the 1926 Roman Catholic Relief Act that the government finally let go of the legal ability to confiscate any property bequeathed in a will for so-called superstitious purposes, such as donations to a Catholic monastery. 1926. So for Tolkien, it would not have been at all surprising if Lewis's Ulster Protestant background would have been a red flag. Why should he be friends with someone who had an anti-Catholic background? So on both sides, the friendship might have died before it even started. But that's not what happened. As the 1930s unfolded, the two men grew closer and closer, sparking ideas off of each other. As a friend remarked, they were like two young bear cubs sometimes, just happily quipping with one another. Now, this is not to say that it was all smooth sailing. They had their differences and their disagreements. And after Lewis died, Tolkien commented to his son Michael that he and Lewis had ceased to be intimates in the previous 10 years. Now, sometimes this is taken as indicating a sort of rift or falling out between the two men later in their lives. But this was not the view of those who knew them both. As his daughter Priscilla noted, in the late 1950s and into the 1960s, they experienced a loosening of the bonds, but, she says, the affection remained. Looking at the context, as we should do, the fact is that both men were very busy. Both of them were writing books. Tolkien had grandchildren by then, and by the mid-1950s, Lewis was working in Cambridge during the week, working in his position of the Cambridge chair that Tolkien himself had expended a great deal of energy and effort to secure for him. It's not surprising that they didn't spend as much time with each other as they had in the 1930s and the 1940s. But as Tolkien himself reflected, we owed each a great debt to the other, and that tie, with the great affection it begot, remains. When Lewis died in 1963, at the relatively early age of 64, Tolkien was devastated, saying that it feels like an axe blow near the roots. Later that day, he attended Lewis's funeral at the Anglican Church of Holy Trinity, Headington Quarry. It was a quiet occasion, and it caught his attention that Lewis's grave was beneath a large tree. Not only were Tolkien and Lewis great friends, although all through their lives, they helped each other along their respective spiritual journeys. When Lewis and Tolkien became friends, starting in 1926, Lewis was at that time gradually moving towards belief in God, partly through his philosophical engagement with the idea of objective value, and partly through his steadily advancing intimacy with Tolkien. Lewis recorded one occasion that they sat discoursing of the gods and giants in Asgard for 3 hours. The fire was bright and the talk good. It went on until 2:30 in the morning. Don't know what Edith thought about that. Now, the most significant of these nighttime conversations was in September of 1931. Tolkien joined Lewis and his visiting friend Hugo Dyson for an evening at Magdalen College. Dyson was an Anglican. Lewis was a newly minted theist, but not yet a Christian. After dinner, the three men took a stroll around Addison's Walk, a beautiful tree-lined path circling parkland where the college's fallow deer roam. They began with discussions of myth and metaphor, and then turned to the topic of Christianity. And a week after this conversation, Lewis said that he passed on from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ, in Christianity. My long night talk with Dyson and Tolkien had a good deal to do with it. Tolkien, therefore, had a significant influence on Lewis's conversion to Christianity. But it was not just a one-way relationship. Lewis, in turn, had an important impact on Tolkien's spiritual life. As we've already seen, when the two first met in 1926, Tolkien was at a bit of a low ebb in his spiritual life. One of the factors in its renewal was, I am sure, his friendship with Lewis. It seems very probable that the discussions and the lively disagreements with his non-Christian friend over the next few years contributed to the gradual revitalization of Tolkien's own spiritual health. Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another, as Proverbs 27 puts it. In explaining Christianity to an intelligent, thoughtful friend and colleague who would have actively challenged him, Tolkien would have found himself compelled to think more deeply about his own beliefs, what he held to be true, and why. Around that time, Tolkien wrote in his diary that not only did he enjoy Lewis's friendship, but that it has done me much good from the contact with a man at once honest, brave, intellectual, and a lover, at least after a long pilgrimage of our Lord. And in helping Lewis towards Christian conversion, Tolkien was helping his own faith too. Now, Tolkien's friendship with C.S. Lewis was begun and strongly formed when they were both relatively young men at the start of their respective academic careers. And Tolkien's gift for friendship allowed him to bond with Lewis despite the great differences between them when they first met. But another remarkable thing about Tolkien's capacity for friendship is that it stayed strong over the years. It didn't fade as he grew older. In the 1950s, success of The Lord of the Rings brought newfound wealth to Tolkien, but it also brought the necessity to deal with innumerable problems, from printing errors and American pirate editions to bad translators and worse ideas for film treatments. And it also brought masses of correspondence. Tolkien spent an enormous amount of time responding in detail to readers who had queries about his invented world, his invented languages, and the story of The Lord of the Rings. And with all of this attention on The Lord of the Rings, it would have been very easy for Tolkien to turn inward and focus exclusively on his literary world, especially since so many of his other ties had been naturally lost through the passing of time. By the mid-1950s, C.S. Lewis was working in Cambridge and would soon be married, and then, of course, he died in 1963. It would have been understandable if, after Tolkien's retirement from Oxford University, he had withdrawn into a more private sphere. But that's not what happened. Though he was not as energetic and adaptable as he had been in his younger years, Tolkien continued to look outward. And in fact, in the last decade of his life, he made a number of new friends. And one of those new friends was, in fact, Clyde Kilby. We knew we were getting there. And Kilby represented both an ecumenical and an international friendship. Kilby was an American evangelical, a professor of English literature right here at Wheaton College, and a great admirer of The Lord of the Rings. Kilby visited Tolkien at his home in Headington in 1964, in part in the hopes of getting some of Tolkien's manuscripts for the college. And this initial meeting burgeoned into a warm friendship. In 1966, Kilby spent the summer in Oxford assisting Tolkien with his work on preparing the text of the Silmarillion for publication. Now, they didn't get very far with the Silmarillion manuscripts, but they did develop a warm friendship. Tolkien felt at ease with Kilby. He spoke with him regularly and openly about his Christian faith. Kilby recalled that in their conversations, every single day he would get onto scriptural things. Tolkien, he said, was deeply moved by the degradation involved in God's becoming one of us, by the birth of Christ in a stable with its filth and manure, which Kilby said that Tolkien saw as a symbol of the real nature of holy things in a fallen world. And Kilby recalled that Tolkien also spoke of his special regard for the book of Luke, and for a specific reason, because that writer included so much about women. Kilby also gives us a glimpse of Tolkien's mature prayer life, recalling that Tolkien told me that he had many times been given a story as an answer to prayer. Mrs. Tolkien joined him in remarking that one of their children had been cured, as they firmly believed, of a heart ailment through prayer. And perhaps because Kilby was also himself a literary critic and an experienced teacher, Tolkien felt able to discuss the Christian themes in his writing, confident that Kilby would appreciate the nuances of his approach. So, for instance, Kilby reported, Professor Tolkien talked to me at some length about his use of the word holy in the Silmarillion. Very specifically, he told me that the secret fire sent to burn at the heart of the world in the beginning was the Holy Spirit. So far tonight, we've looked at some important aspects of Tolkien's life. We've looked at his childhood suffering. We've looked a little bit at his experiences in the Great War. We've looked at his friendships with C.S. Lewis and Clyde Kilby. So what can we as Christians learn from Tolkien that will help us in our lives of faith? Let me offer 5 brief insights for your reflection. First, Tolkien's life of faith shows us the importance of coming to terms with suffering, loss, and sorrow in our lives of faith. One of the most moving lines in the Lord of the Rings is at the very end, when Frodo explains to Sam that he has been wounded too deeply, that he must go on to the Grey Havens, and he can't live out his life in the restored Shire as he had hoped. He says, "I have been too deeply hurt, Sam. I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me." But not for me. I always find that line so moving. Tolkien recognized that there are some wounds that we can receive that cannot be healed in this life. But we can place our trust in our Lord, our crucified Savior, who even in his glorious resurrected body bears the marks of the nails in his hands and his feet and his side. We will be better witnesses to the gospel, as well as more grounded in our own spiritual lives, as we learn how to live our faith, not in spite of suffering, but through it. Second, Tolkien shows us the importance of growth in charity and forgiveness. Our Lord's most challenging command, of course, is love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Tolkien would have been the first to admit that he didn't practice these virtues perfectly. He was a flawed man, and he knew it. But he shows us that these virtues are worth striving for, and that with God's grace, we can grow in these virtues. And he recognized that this growth is an organic process. Tolkien spoke of the role of repentance in the Christian life, and he noted that this works, as he put it, spirally and not in a closed circle. You might seem like you're coming back on yourself, but you're making progress little by little. Third, Tolkien shows us the importance of being well grounded in the faith. We saw that when the cataclysm of the Great War came, he was able to get through it with his faith intact, in large part because of his solid formation in the faith as a boy. He knew what he believed, and he knew why he believed it. He had a life of prayer. He had a life of reading the scriptures. Now, we don't know what tests and tribulations are ahead of us, but we can strive to root ourselves deeply in our faith right now, today. Fourth, Tolkien shows us the value of persistence in our faith, especially when we're going through a dry spell. He kept going. He could have despaired, but he didn't. He said, "I almost ceased to practice my religion." He recognizes that he went through that dry spell, but that almost is important. He kept going even when it was really dry and tough. I wonder if he ever shared his experiences about the barren stretch in his spiritual life in his conversations with his friend Lewis. I think he probably did. And I wonder if that might maybe have contributed a little bit to Lewis's great insight in the Screwtape Letters about the law of undulation and the fact that every Christian will go through times when the life of faith feels very dry. After all, Lewis did dedicate the Screwtape Letters to Tolkien. And fifth, Tolkien shows us the deep and enduring value of spiritual friendships. We are not meant to go it alone in the Christian life. We need each other, and we can help each other through all the difficulties and the joys of our journeys of faith. Tolkien's third given name was Reuel, which in Hebrew means friend of God. and he noted that it appears in the Old Testament as the name of Moses' father-in-law. This name was important to him. He gave it to all 4 of his children, his daughter as well as his 3 sons. To be a Christian is fundamentally to be a friend of God. Tolkien was committed through his whole life to being a friend of God, and I think that his witness can help us to that end as well. Thank you. All right, so I would be delighted to do Q&A. And might we turn off that fan, do you think? Yes.
Okay, questions? That was one of the best lectures that has been given in this building, so thank you very much. Very insightful.
My pleasure.
Your comment about their mutual fit reminded me, I was giving a radio interview about 10 years ago, and I said, if it wasn't for Tolkien, you might never have heard of Lewis, because you might not have become a Christian. And if it wasn't for Lewis, we might never have heard of Tolkien, because he might not have published these great works. And the interviewer said, yes, and if it wasn't for Lewis and Tolkien, we might never have heard of you. So that reminded me of a comment about the weight. Questions?
We have a question here, I think.
Wonderful talk, and thank you for the eye-opening material. Could you say a little bit more about the development of their friendship? I understand it didn't exactly get off to an auspicious beginning.
Yeah, so, I mean, it is fun to think about this because we do take for granted, of course, they became friends. But Lewis in particular was not terribly impressed with Tolkien when they met. He wrote in his diary that he met Tolkien at this faculty meeting. And faculty meetings are not necessarily the best place to meet your friends. Yeah. So he said, yes, Tolkien, smooth, pale, fluent little chap. No harm in him, only needs a smack or so. So, and we don't know exactly what Tolkien thought of Lewis at that time, but yeah. So they weren't necessarily hitting it off right away, but they had occasions to meet and to talk. And what really connected them was a mutual love of Norse sagas. And they oh, you like that too? And of course, is what Lewis talks about as the friend who has the same interest. Oh, you like that too? And Lewis became part of the Coal-Biters, the group that Tolkien had founded. And Tolkien was a very sociable man. He was always founding clubs and societies and things. And so he founded this club to get people together to read the Norse sagas in the original Icelandic, as one does. And Lewis is joining voluntarily. Doesn't he have to twist his arm? And so they have this friendship. And then something kind of amazing happens. Now, Tolkien had been working on the stories of his legendarium ever since really the Great War. It's around 1916-ish. And that ish is a shout out to John Garth, who knows exactly to like the minute when these things happened. He would be the one to ask ish. He wrote the Tale of the Fall of Gondolin. He's working on these poems, these stories, and he had been working on a poem called The Lay of Leithian, which centers around the tale that would eventually be of Beren and Luthien. This becomes one of the great tales of Middle-earth, and it's one that's very personally important to Tolkien because Luthien is associated with the figure of his wife, Edith. So this is a really deeply personal poem, and Tolkien was throughout his life very shy about sharing his creative work with other people. He was very sensitive, sometimes oversensitive, but he shows his unfinished poem to his new friend Lewis. Things could have gone very badly, but Lewis, who also had a tremendous gift and capacity for friendship, does exactly the right thing. First of all, he loves the poem, and he immediately responds warmly with praise. Tolkien, I loved it. This was so good. I would have loved it even if it wasn't written by my friend. So he affirms Tolkien first. Okay, And then he does Tolkien the great honor of respecting him as a creative writer by giving a serious and thorough critique of the poem. But he does it in a humorous way, as if it's this manuscript being attested by these 4 different scholars that are debating over authentic reading. Oh, this line is unworthy of the original scribe. This is clearly not the right reading. And so it was the most brilliant way to offer a critique. And Tolkien is delighted by it. Now, he never finished the poem. But he did begin to make revisions on it that took into account Lewis's suggestions. But more importantly, he realized he had somebody who understood what he was doing, who cared about what he was doing, and whom he could trust with his creative work. And I think that was a real bonding moment for them, and really important for their friendship. Yeah. Good, another question.
I have a question from an audience member about Edith. How did Edith fit into Tolkien's spiritual journey?
Well, I mean, she was his wife, so obviously she had a place in that.
Thank you for that answer. Move on.
Yes. Well, this is a kind of a tricky question to answer in a way, because I have tried to be very focused in looking at Tolkien's life, because Tolkien himself was a public figure and knew he was a public figure, and he spoke publicly about his faith. So he himself was very forthright in talking about his faith, and he's the figure that we're studying. When I wrote Tolkien's faith, I focused just on Tolkien. I don't look at other people's lives of faith except insofar as they intersect with Tolkien's own life of faith. So I haven't considered Edith's own journey of faith, or even any children, only the way in which they intersect with his life. So to answer that question sort of briefly, what was Edith's role in that? I would point out one particular thing, and that is that when he was undergraduate, he had a 3-year spell in which he was forbidden to see her or contact her. And that in itself is a remarkable story. Father Francis had forbidden him from seeing her for various actually quite good reasons, which Tolkien acknowledged. It was very hard and painful at the time, but he came to recognize that they were legitimate reasons. The really remarkable thing is that Tolkien obeyed him, and he didn't have to, because when he was right under his eye in Birmingham, okay, fine. But he goes to Oxford, and he continues to obey the stricture, even though he could easily have written to Edith or contacted her, and Father Francis would never have known. But Father Francis was his second father. He loved him, and so he honored his word to him. So it's a very painful separation. And then he reconnects with Edith after he's 21. He reconnects with her, and they become engaged. And he had, in his first year at Oxford, gone through a slump in his faith. He admitted that he was slack. He was skipping going to church. He was in a low ebb. But when he reconnects with Edith, he kind of pulls himself together, and she becomes a motivating factor. His love for her inspired him to be a better Christian. And I think that, again, is a beautiful way in which our friendships, our loves, we can help each other in our spiritual lives.
Given that one of your first books was about your own hard-won faith, you chose to call it Not God's Type. What parallels do you see between your journey of faith and Tolkien's, if any?
Well, that's an interesting question. In some ways, our journeys are quite different, because Tolkien was a lifelong Christian. He wasn't a lifelong Catholic, but he was a lifelong Christian. And his journey of faith was, he had moments of being tested, but he never walked away from his faith. Whereas I was an atheist, and then I became a Christian as an adult. So my own journey is more similar to C.S. Lewis in that respect than to Tolkien. But I will say that reading, learning about Tolkien's life of faith, seeing the growth of it, I already admired him. I already knew he had a beautiful faith. But after doing the research for Tolkien's faith, I really felt my own faith strengthened by it. Now, the book is just about Tolkien's life. It's it's not a devotional book in any way. It's just a story of Tolkien's life, his faith. But you just look at it and you think, wow, I thought this is a beautiful witness. So I felt myself very encouraged by it in my own journey of faith. Maybe over there?
Thank you, Doctor, for writing this book. I'm about a third of the way through it now, so it's possible you address the question later on, but I don't know. As I'm sure you know, when the Catholic Church canonizes a man or a woman for the veneration of the people of God, she declares that that person lived a life of heroic virtue, and that there is some sort of a reflection of Jesus' life in that person. So what I'm wondering is, as you looked at Tolkien's life of faith, do you see instances of heroic virtue, and what reflection of Christ do you see in his life?
I do, and it's a really good question. And I do think he shows heroic virtue in a way that is particularly valuable for the modern day, because his life was in most respects completely ordinary. He was an academic. He graded papers until he wanted to scream. He was so bored of reading student essays. He had 4 children. He was married for 55 years. He had lots of committee meetings. He just had an ordinary life. And yet he lived through extraordinary times, but he lived through them as an ordinary layman. And he was faithful through all of that. And I think that, and of course he lived through some of the most testing times, the 1960s, moments of upheaval, tumult, changes in the church that could easily have disrupted his life of faith. The Latin liturgy that he loved so much was abandoned. He found that very painful. But he said, loyalty is only a virtue when it's tested. And he says the only thing to do is to pray, and that's what he did. And I think that, when we look at people who are martyred, or people who, the great missionaries, they can be inspiring, and they are inspiring. They're important to have as witnesses. But I think there's a real need for the quiet witnesses, the men and women who just carry on and live that life of faith and persist in their devotional lives and their lives of prayer. And I think we see that in Tolkien, and that sort of recognition. And I think the Christ-likeness that I see in him, I think comes from the fact that he strove to be self-giving. It was interesting, he so seldom finished anything. And interestingly, his publisher remarked that was in part because he was selfless, that if he had been more ruthless in sticking to his own desires and needs, he could have finished a lot of the things. He could have plowed through and got them done. But he had his children, his grandchildren, his students, his wife, his friends. He gave time to them. And that time came from what? Came from the things he cared about. And I see that as that giving of time, the things he could have finished, could have published, but didn't because he was helping out somebody else. That, I think, is a Christ-like self-sacrifice. Let's see, maybe we'll get someone from this side of the room. Maybe over here? You have a very small, quiet hand over there. Yes,
Okay.
There we go.
I just wanted to mention this book could be called Tolkien for Protestants. You have a wonderful glossary of terms like beatification and canonization, and you translate some of Tolkien's favorite psalms from Latin into English. So it's very helpful.
Actually, I want to add a little bit of that. So two interesting points. One is that very much I want it to be a guide to understanding Tolkien's faith, because if you are not a Catholic, how would you know what these words mean? I mean, why should you? But Tolkien uses them. He talks, for instance, about, the Assumption. Well, what on earth is that, right? I'll look in the glossary, right? So I really wanted to make this accessible so that you can just understand what is Tolkien talking about. But this is very nerdy, and I delight in this. I have 2 appendices. I mean, come on. Can you tell I'm a Tolkien scholar or what? But in the appendices, I have 3 of the Psalms that he knew by heart. We know that he had them memorized. He recommended memorizing the 3 of the Psalms of Praise. And I have the Latin as he would have had them memorized, and the Latin, by the way, I got from a contemporary version that he would have known, and the English is from a contemporary English translation that he would have known. So all the appendices are texts that are contemporary to Tolkien's own day. So I think that's just a little extra level of nerddom that I couldn't resist pointing out. Yes.
Good. Question.
I heard a theory that Charles Williams was one of the factors that resulted in Tolkien and Lewis's rift, or what people consider Tolkien and Lewis's rift. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, like whether or not that's true, or how much Charles Williams had an impact on their relationship.
Yeah, that's a good question. Charles Williams is a very weird guy. And I know this because I'm actually the Charles Williams subject editor for the Journal of Inkling Studies. And I have read almost everything that Williams has published. Quite. I think that Tolkien was concerned that his friend Lewis was kind of losing his head over his new friend. Lewis could be very enthusiastic about his new friends. He had a great capacity for friendship, but this sometimes could lead him to just think the new friend was just the best thing ever. And he's just bowled over by Williams. And I think Tolkien was just a little bit concerned that maybe Williams was somebody that you ought to be just a little more cautious about, like not to be so uncritical of and so enthusiastic about everything. And I think he had a point, right? So Tolkien had, I think, conflicted feelings about Williams. He liked him personally. They got on well personally. But then after Williams's death, he started, I think, to think, about his, because he'd read various his books. He didn't like the spiritual thrillers at all. Didn't like the poetry at all. And I think he started to feel that there's something off about Williams. This is my interpretation, because there's just some phrasings in the letters where he's starting to put Williams more at arm's length, and I think it's that he's realizing there's just something a little bit off about him. And in their time, neither Lewis nor Tolkien had any way of knowing that in fact Williams was really quite weird, because Williams compartmentalized his life to an exceptional degree. But he was really weird. Read the biography by Greville Lindup. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to illustrate what you said, in one letter, Tolkien called Williams a witch doctor. But on the other hand, the 2 of them would get together for lunch or a drink, just the 2 of them. They didn't need Lewis as a buffer, or they didn't need the Inklings.
Yeah.
So that kind of shows the tension there between his mixed feelings about Williams. Other questions?
Saw a hand over there.
That was an excellent talk. And I'm not sure where I heard this, but I did hear that Lewis sort of attached himself to 3 people in his life. One was Mrs. Moore, the other was Charles William, and the other was Joy Davidman. And I think Tolkien saw some of that, but I was wondering if you could speak to Tolkien's relationship with Joy Davidman and how I really don't know much about how Tolkien felt about her, except that I feel like it wasn't that receptive.
Yeah, we don't know a lot about that. He didn't particularly like her, but most of Lewis's friends didn't like her, and she was very abrasive. She was from New York, and she was an American. And I've spent, the last 15 years, I spent a lot of time. I spent about 3 months of the year in England, and I get English culture, and so now I understand just how off-putting that can be. Who is this lady elbowing her way into this friendship? And I think that Tolkien and others of Lewis's friends thought correctly that Joy was setting her cap at Lewis, and Lewis all innocent of this. And they were worried about Lewis's well-being. And Abigail Santamaria's biography of Joy is fantastic in that regard, because she really shows it from Joy's point of view, and she was. She was setting her cap for Lewis. And I think he was, I think, a bit protective of his friend, and I think that's understandable. But it's interesting, you know, as with so many things with their friendship, any hint of tension tends to get overplayed. I don't know why people like this whole frenemies idea. No, no. So, like for instance, at one point, Tolkien's wife Edith was in the same hospital as Joy, and the two wives got along famously. So, you know, yeah.
Walter Hooper said once that Lewis, in every decade of his life, he tended to have a first friend. And as a child, it was his brother Warren. And in his teens, it was Arthur Greaves, the love of Norse mythology. In his 20s, it was Owen Barfield. In his 30s, it was Tolkien. In his 40s, it was Charles Williams. And then his 50s became Joy Davidman. And then later in life, he came full circle back to his brother Warren. That was an interesting theory. It doesn't match 10 years at a time, but he always seemed to want to have a first friend that he was very enthusiastic about.
Let's see. Do we have any more questions?
Thank you all for coming. I'm going to transport Holly to the bookshop so she can get settled and sign books that you can buy at 20% off just today or tomorrow. Thank you so much for coming. Great questions. I'm sure you all felt as enriched as I did. Bye-bye.